Lecture 8. Same body, same brain, and closest continuer.
We've been considering the question of personal survival over time. How is it that you now and your 8-year-old self are numerically the same person? We know that you have a different personality now, and that you know different things, etc., but you are still the same person. Last lecture, we looked at a psychological criterion for personal identity survival. Namely, could it be that having the same psychology over one's lifetime preserves personal identity? We saw that the answer seems to be no. The breaking of one's psychological continuity does not entail the ending of a person, and the possibility of two separate people both being psychologically continuous with a third lends itself to logical contradiction. But maybe, instead of psychological continuity, it's physical continuity that matters for survival. Maybe it's in virtue of you and your 8-year-old self having the same body that you are the same person. Let's see if we can talk ourselves through this idea so that we can arrive at a good criterion that suggests that physical continuity is what matters over time. Immediately, you probably realize that merely having the same body over time won't preserve personal identity for reasons that we have already discussed. Technically speaking, you do not have the same body that you did when you were 8 years old. Over time, your body replaces its material with material that you ingest so that after roughly 7 years, your body is made of completely new material. But maybe we can reconceive what it means to have the same body. Yes, your body replaces its cells and atoms with new material, but maybe that replacement happens gradually enough that we can still say it's the same body. Recall the ship of Theseus, where Theseus has a ship that he sends on a journey, but the wood that makes up the ship slowly rots as the journey progresses. The crew replaces that wood with planks from wooden barrels that held their food, and by the time they arrive at their destination, the ship is made of entirely different material. Is it the same ship? Is it Theseus's ship when it arrives? Most people think it is. If someone had simply destroyed the original ship and built a new one out of new wood, we wouldn't think so. But the fact that the material of the ship is replaced gradually, one plank at a time, seems to make a difference. So maybe we can say the same thing about our bodies. Even though the parts of our bodies are replaced over time, since the replacement is gradual, it is still true that we have the same body. And so maybe it is in virtue of you having the same body now as you had when you were 8 years old that you now and your 8-year-old self are the same person. But even if gradual replacement can preserve identity, a topic that we will return to shortly, there is still another problem. It doesn't seem that the preservation of your entire body is what matters. Suppose you lose a leg. Are you still the same person? Suppose you have heart problems and someone donates their heart to you. Are you still the same person? Suppose one day in the future we perfect the full body transplant, where if your body is damaged, we can take your brain and place it into a new body, saving your brain. Would you still be the same person? Again, depending on what kind of body you get, your personality might change, but you would still be the same person, right? If you had wronged someone before the transplant, you would still have to apologize to them after the transplant. Since your brain is what realizes your psychology, it is the physical continuity of your brain specifically that would seem to matter for survival. But this is also a little short-sighted. After all, once you die and your brain ceases to function, it still exists. That piece of you in your corpse's skull is physically continuous with the brain you had in life. But you no longer exist. Well, unless you think that your soul floats away to heaven. If you think that, then you don't think your brain has anything to do with personal survival. The point is, if you think the survival of your brain is what preserves your personal identity, you don't think it's just merely the existence of your brain. It has to be functioning too. So perhaps it is the physical continuity of a functioning brain that preserves identity over time. I think we're getting close to getting a good criterion, but there's one more thing to consider: cryogenics. Recently, some people have taken to freezing themselves before death in the hopes that one day medical science will develop a cure for what is killing them. and then they can be thawed out, cured, and sent along their way. We have yet to do this successfully, although I do believe that some small animals have been flash frozen, thawed, and survived. But it's conceivable that we will one day do this with people. If we do, the person who was thawed and cured will still be the same person who was dying and frozen. Yet, there was a period of time during which they had no functioning brain. The physical continuity of their functioning brain was broken. And so we need a criterion that allows for cryogenic patients to still be the same person once they are thawed and cured. The philosopher Peter Unger proposes just such a criterion. Unger says, suppose some person X right now has mental capacities. Some future person Y is identical to person X, in other words, X will survive into the future, if and only if three things are true. First, person Y has to have mental capacities. Second, the brain that realizes person Y's mental capacities has to be physically continuous with the brain that realized person X's mental capacities. And third, there has to be no moment in time between the existence of person X and person Y where that physically continuous object, that brain, did not have mental capacities. Now that was a bit complicated. Let's handle and explore each one of these in turn. What does Unger mean by mental capacities? Basically, a brain has mental capacities when it has the ability to mentate, the ability to produce a mind. But Unger wants to define this very broadly. For example, he would say that the brain of a coma patient has mental capacities, even if it is unable to mentate while the patient is in a coma, as long as that person is potentially curable, as long as there is some physically possible medical technique that could bring them out of the coma. Their brain has the capacity to mentate, even though it is not currently able to mentate, as long as it is possible for it to again mentate one day. Unger wants to define curable in terms of physically possible medical techniques because, and this is an interesting point, he doesn't think whether someone has mental capacities is relative to what historical time period they find themselves in. If we defined having mental capacities in terms of whether or not the doctors treating the person could bring them out of the coma, then you could have two people in a physically identical condition, and yet you would have to say that one of them has mental capacities while the other one doesn't, simply because one of them finds himself in a less medically advanced society than the other. This just doesn't seem right. If one has mental capacities, the other one does too. Okay. On to the second criterion. What does Unger mean when he requires person Y's brain to be physically continuous with person X's brain? Just what you think, to be made of the same material. However, just like in the Ship of Theseus example, Unger does allow for gradual replacement over time to preserve physical identity. And why does Unger not allow for a temporal gap? A time when that physically continuous brain didn't realize mental capacities? Because he doesn't think that personal identity can tolerate temporal gaps. Once a person ceases to exist, they will never exist again. If you disagree with this and think a person can cease to exist and then come back into existence, you could simply drop this third requirement from your criteria, but I think most find it intuitive. Unger's view gets us some pretty intuitive results. It certainly accounts for ordinary survival. If person X is your 8-year-old self and person Y is you now, clearly all the criteria are met. It also accounts for a cryogenic patient surviving over time since there was a physically possible medical science that could allow their brain to mentate again. It also says that material transport, like on Star Trek, would preserve personal identity. The Spock that appears on the planet would be the same as the Spock who stepped onto the transporter pad, since they are made of the same material and thus physically continuous. Although you might want to make sure that the transporter borrows the matter from Spock's original brain to make his reconstructed brain. But if the signal while Spock is beaming back gets interrupted and the transporter has to use new matter to reconstruct Spock, then that is not the same person. It's just a copy, because the physical continuity has been broken. If you don't find that last result intuitive, you're not alone. Some people think that information transport does preserve personal identity. Physical continuity is not needed. But regardless of how well thought out and nuanced Unger's criterion is, it is subject to a couple of pretty serious objections. But to understand these objections, you'll need to understand the problem with metaphysical vagueness. A concept is vague when it is not always clear when something matches up to it. A famous example is the pile-heap problem. Suppose you have a very small pile of sand. You then add one grain at a time. Once you have added billions upon billions of grains, clearly the pile is now a heap. But at what point did the pile become a heap? After which grain was added? There is no real answer to this question because heap is a vague concept. There are borderline cases where it simply is not clear whether the concept applies. This is not that troubling because we don't think that heaps have a separate metaphysical or ontological existence beyond the grains of sand that make them up. There is nothing extra that comes into existence once you add the right number of grains of sand. They are just collections of grains of sand that we choose to describe in certain ways. One person might call it a heap, another one might not, and neither one is necessarily wrong. It's just a description. But we can't tolerate vagueness when we are dealing with numerical identity. Either something is the same object or it is not. In the same way, it seems that either some future person is identical to you or that person is not. Whether a person still exists must have either a yes or a no answer. Whether a person still exists is not merely a matter of description where it depends on what definition you wish to apply. If you step into a transporter, disappear, and then a person appears on Mars, either that person is you or it's not. Either you will still be having experiences or you won't, and some other person who only thinks they are you will be having experiences. Personal survival is not a vague notion. Therefore, there must be a concrete answer to questions of personal survival. What this means is that our criterion of what accounts for personal survival cannot be vague. It cannot give us indeterminate answers to any questions of personal survival. It must always give us a hard yes or no. The problem with Unger's criterion is that it does not do this. As nuanced as it is still subject to vagueness. For example, Unger allows for physical continuity to be preserved even if there is complete physical replacement, as long as that replacement is gradual. He even allows for that replacement to happen as fast as you like, as long as it is still done one atom at a time. But, he says, if I were to replace 1/4 of your brain at a time, that would be too much all at once. That would not be gradual enough, and so the physical continuity would be broken, and you would cease to exist. But presumably, if I replaced 2 atoms at once, that would still count as gradual, right? But what about 3? 4 at once? 5? You can see where I'm going with this. How many atoms would be too many at once? It would seem that the answer simply depends on your definition of gradual, which thus makes Unger's view vague and thus inadequate as a criterion for personal survival over time. Unger's view also seems to underappreciate the importance of the preservation of one's mind for survival. After all, in the mind-switching thought experiment, where I erased you and the stranger's brain and wrote your neural configuration onto their brain, our intuition was pretty strong that we follow our mind. After the procedure, we would find ourselves in the other body, even though it is not physically continuous with ours. But that's not what Unger's view would say. We might try to combine a few views here to arrive at a better criterion. Maybe both psychological continuity and physical continuity play a role in preserving personal identity. This is perhaps the most intuitive theory we have seen so far. But it too is subject to the problem of metaphysical vagueness simply because both psychological and physical continuity are matters of degree. To appreciate the problem, let me borrow and modify an argument from Derek Parfit. He's a bigwig in philosophy of mind who doesn't agree with the view I'm describing here, but a lot of the points I am making were inspired by him. Imagine a square that represents all the possible degrees to which a surviving person could be psychologically and physically continuous with you. On the upper left is someone who is 100% both physically and psychologically continuous with you. On the lower right is someone who is neither physically nor psychologically continuous with you. On another corner is someone who is completely physically continuous, but not at all psychologically continuous. And on the opposite corner is someone who is fully psychologically continuous, but not physically. And in the middle of the square would be persons of varying degrees of both physical and psychological continuity. Now, clearly the person who is 0% physically and psychologically continuous with you is not the same person. Clearly the person who is 100% psychologically and physically continuous with you is the same person. But what about all the people in between? Remember, personal identity cannot tolerate metaphysical vagueness. There has to be an absolute fact about whether you survive. So you're going to have to draw a line through this graph that determines what preserves survival and what doesn't. But any line that you would draw would be counterintuitive. Let's say you draw it right down the middle so that someone who was 50-50 is identical to you, but someone who was 49-50 isn't. Just one little percent can cause you to cease to exist and create a new person? That didn't happen when it was 51-50%. That didn't make any difference at all. But suddenly 1 more percent makes that difference? That seems silly. Yet this is exactly what this criterion suggests. In fact, all the criteria up until now have been subject to something like this problem. To deal with this problem, and others like it, the philosopher Robert Nozick developed the closest continuer view. Recall last lecture, our intuitions about personal identity seem to conflict. If I'm going to write a new psychology onto your brain before your body is tickle tortured, that doesn't really keep you from being tortured. That just means that you will have a new psychology while you're being tickle tortured. But if I also write your psychology onto another brain that won't be tickle tortured, we would think that would save us, even though what happens to our original body is the same. Nozick accounts for this intuition by suggesting that whether and in what body you survive is sensitive to context. Basically, you will always be the closest continuer. That is, you will be the future person that is most similar to you right now. What does Nozick mean by similarity? In short, the person most similar to you is the one who shares the most psychological and physical continuity. Though Nozick puts more importance on psychological continuity. So of course, in everyday survival, you are the same person over time because there is only one obvious candidate. Moment to moment, the person in your body is the closest continuer to the person that was in your body a moment ago. And you now is identical to your 8-year-old self because you are your 8-year-old self's closest continuer. No presently existing person has such a high degree of psychological and physical continuity with your 8-year-old self than you. Nozick's theory also helps us make sense of our seemingly contradictory intuitions. If all I am going to do is write a new psychology on your brain, that won't prevent you from being tickle tortured because the person being tickle tortured is the only obvious candidate for survival. That person is the closest continuer. They have no psychological continuity, but they do have physical continuity. However, if I write a new psychology on your brain, but also write your old psychology onto a stranger's brain, then the person that now inhabits the stranger is the closest continuer. Although he's not physically continuous, the stranger is psychologically continuous, and that's more important. That makes that person the closest continuer, and so that's you. The closest continuer theory gives intuitive answers to most of the thought experiments that such theories are subjected to. Would you survive a brain transplant? Yes. Would you survive the extraction of half of your brain? Yes. Would Spock be the same person as he beams down to the planet? Yes. And if his signal is interrupted while beaming back to the ship, and the Enterprise has to use new matter to save him? Yes, he would still be Spock. That is the closest existing continuer. Now, if you died and someone by pure coincidence woke up on the other side of the world with a new psychology that was completely continuous with yours, even though that is the closest continuer, Nozick wouldn't say that is you. He thinks the continuity must have a causal component. But the closest continuer view can successfully answer many thought experiment counterexamples that have been raised by philosophers against other theories. For example, what if you step in a transporter to Mars? It records your information, destroys your original body, and creates a new person on Mars with new material. That would be you, right? But suppose the transporter didn't destroy you. It just records your physical structure and sends that information to Mars, where the transporter there takes new existing matter and constructs a new body based on that structure. That person isn't you, right? It seems not. Yet the only difference between the two stories is your destruction. There is psychological continuity in both. Some philosophers use this example to argue against the pure psychological criterion. However, Nozick's closest continuer view gives us a nice answer to both cases. If your original body on Earth is destroyed, then the person on Mars is you because that's the closest continuer. If your original body is not destroyed, then the person on Mars is not you because the closest continuer is on Earth. That body is both psychologically and physically continuous with the original. Nozick's theory can even give a definitive answer to the Riker splitting case. Recall, when Riker beamed back up from the planet, a transporter accident made two of him. Two 100% psychologically and 50% physically continuous with Riker persons. Which one is Riker? According to Nozick, neither. Survival is accomplished if there is a closest continuer, but there is no closest continuer in the Riker case. There is a tie. The answer is the transporter accident actually killed Riker and created two new persons. Nozick is perfectly fine with accepting this answer. But some philosophers are not, because it seems to violate something they call the only X and Y principle. Now, what's that? It suggests that whether or not two things, call them X and Y, are identical can only be determined by the properties that X and Y possess. The existence of some other thing Z cannot be relevant to whether or not they are identical. Notice that the same process that brought a version of Riker up to the ship would have still occurred regardless of whether a duplicate of him was created on the planet. And if there was no duplicate, obviously that would be Riker. But if that process by itself is enough to preserve the personal identity of Riker, how could the existence of the duplicate change that fact? How could that fact be relevant? But Nozick argues that the existence of other objects can be relevant when dealing with identity. Consider the Vienna Circle, a collection of philosophers who met in Austria to discuss philosophy. Let's say there were 20 members, but then World War II broke out and many fled Austria. Let's say 5 of them make it to London and continue meeting. Is that the Vienna Circle? It would seem so. But if another 10 had made their way to New York City and were meeting to talk philosophy there, that would seem to be the Vienna Circle. The existence of that group would be relevant to whether the London group would be the Vienna Circle. And certainly, if instead 10 members had remained behind in Austria and were still meeting, that would be the Vienna Circle. That would be the closest continuer. In fact, the Riker example might even show that the only X and Y principle is false. The presence of the second Riker negates the possibility of Riker's survival, since they would both have what is necessary on any criterion, and consequently, selecting either one of them as the true Riker would be arbitrary. Yet there clearly would have been survival had there not been duplication. But there is one counterexample that even Nozick himself admits his closest continuer theory can't quite handle. Recall, according to Nozick, if you step in a transporter and your original matter is destroyed, but your physical configuration is transmitted to Mars and a psychologically identical person is created, that person on Mars is you. They are the closest continuer. But if your matter is not destroyed, the person on Mars is not you. They are merely a duplicate. The person still standing in the transporter on Earth is the closest continuer. They're both physically and psychologically continuous. Clear enough, right? But now suppose that the transporter on Earth doesn't destroy your matter instantaneously, but the scanning process is such that it injures you in some way, entailing that a year later you die of a heart attack. Is the person on Mars you? No. And even after you die, that person will still not be you. It's not like your death would kill the other person that now inhabits that body on Mars. The person on Earth is still the closest continuer. But what if you continue to live on Earth for only 1 hour? Would the person on Mars be you? Again, it seems not, but what if you only lived for half an hour, or 1 minute, or even a second, or a millisecond? If there is any overlap at all, where in the same moment there is a psychologically continuous person on Mars, but a psychologically and physically continuous person on Earth, the transportation process does not preserve identity. But that seems rather odd. Surviving for 1 millisecond could mean that you don't survive at all? You can imagine a very strange scenario where someone steps into a transporter on Earth and then says, "Quick, kill me before the new person is constructed on Mars. Otherwise, I might die." Now, we've been dealing with some very strange and unrealistic thought experiments. It's doubtful that we'll ever have transporters. It would take millions of years to transfer the information regarding the atomic configuration of your body. But again, that a thought experiment could never happen is irrelevant to its point. They are supposed to pull out your intuitions. And our intuitions on this topic, and ultimately the theory of personal identity survival that we accept, is very important. At least, it will likely be to many people in the very near future. Prime among such people is inventor and Google engineer Ray Kurzweil, who thinks we will soon reach the singularity, the time at which computers will become as complicated and able to hold as much information as human brains. He envisions a day when, before you die, you will be able to upload your neural configuration onto a computer brain with an android body. He thinks this will enable him, and all of us, well, at least those of us rich enough to afford such a thing, but he thinks it will enable him to evade death. But will it? Only if an android with a brain configured like yours will be numerically identical with you. But will it? Your answer will depend upon what theory of personal identity you accept. Is mental continuity enough? Well, then it will be you. Is physical continuity also required? Then it won't be you. An android has a physically different brain. Do you like the closest continuer theory? Then you better make sure that you are good and dead before the transfer takes place. If your original body is still living, your android copy won't be the closest continuer. Many Christian philosophers, aware of the problems with the soul hypothesis, suggest that God might facilitate our survival into the afterlife in a similar manner. God can't simply resurrect the bodies of everyone who has died. Most of their bodies have long since decomposed and re-entered the ecosystem. So the atoms of their bodies help compose our bodies today. God couldn't resurrect everyone because we share the material that makes up our bodies. Philosopher John Hicks suggests that, instead, God may do a copy-paste. Copy the neural configuration of your brain and then paste it onto the brain of a new perfected body. But whether or not you think that would constitute survival depends on what theory of personal identity you accept. Philosopher Peter Van Inwagen argues that it would not constitute survival because causation is relevant to an object's identity. For example, if you kick over the Lego house that your son built and put it back together yourself, it's not really his house anymore. He can't show off the house that he built to his friends because he didn't build it. You did. The causal story of how the house's pieces came to be where they are is relevant to the identity of the house. If God creates a neural duplicate by copying and pasting your original brain configuration, God would be rewriting the causal story of your brain. So it wouldn't really be you. In the same way, writing your brain's neural configuration onto an android brain would rewrite the causal history. In the same way, writing your brain's neural configuration onto an android brain would rewrite the causal story. So again, is it really you? Van Inwagen thinks that God would have to steal our brain and central nervous system and replace them with inanimate duplicates before we die if we are to survive into the afterlife. God would literally have to be a body snatcher. Will we have to place our brain in an android body if we want an earthly robotic immortality? Perhaps. Again, how you answer will depend on what theory you adopt. And we've considered numerous theories that try to account for personal survival over time. Psychological continuity, physical continuity, the closest continuer view. They have all fallen short in some way or another. This may be for two reasons. We may be on a fool's errand. The failure of these theories may suggest that persons don't exist at all, and so trying to identify what preserves personal survival is guaranteed to fail. Another possible reason is because we've been looking at the question in the wrong way and thinking about persons in the wrong way. Maybe persons exist, but not like we think they do. It is to these topics that we will turn in the next lecture.